All right, we are now live. So, for the audience that does not know you, feel free to introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Bill Holstein. I've been involved in covering China and technology and corporate worlds for many years. I was a young man and on the ground in China when Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter normalized relations back in 1979. So I've watched the arc of this relationship for all these years, and have been involved in coverage and written multiple books about U.S.-China relations, including this one, Battlefield Cyber. I blew the name. Battlefield Cyber: How China and Russia are undermining American democracy and national security. So this is the fourth in a series of books I've written over a 10-year period of examining what's gone wrong under Xi Jinping's rule in U.S.-Chinese relations.
Right, and we had a long conversation over the phone about a very general overview of your work and how it all started. So, where did this all start? Right, from the beginning. Why did you get involved? Why did you feel the need to start reporting on this? Why did you feel it was information that was necessary to bring to light? Because I just looked up your name now too, and I see it on the Wall Street Journal and all these different news articles. Like, you seem like you're an expert on this, but where did this all come from?
Well, for decades, I believed in what most all Americans believe, that opening China would result in doing business with China and full-hearted business, including technology transfers, would cause the Chinese to embrace the internet, and the middle class presumably and young people presumably would use the internet to build greater pluralism, greater uh, tolerance in their society. And in fact, it worked for a long time. That it gave rise to a very thriving private sector. They had NGOs, foreign NGOs were able to go in and work on environmental issues or women's issues or issues of the minorities that they have. They have more than 50 different tribal groupings. The Han, of course, are the dominant Chinese force. But so it appeared that it was a win-win, win for China, win for the United States, win for the world. The Chinese were coming on, made extraordinary economic gains, and were seemingly embracing the world order that the United States and Japan and Europe had created. So it wasn't until Xi Jinping started taking power in 2012 and consolidated fully in 2013 that we asked ourselves, who is this guy? And it turns out that he came from a different part of the Communist Party, and he marks a pretty radical break in Chinese official thinking about the role of the Communist Party in their society and about China's role in the world. He is a Marxist-Leninist, something we haven't seen since the days of Mao Zedong. And he is determined to use technology to not only control his own population, which is something we're not happy about, but of course it's his choice to create the Great Firewall, for example, which insulates the Chinese from the vast majority of any kind of foreign media influence. But he also very clearly has stated that he and his ally Vladimir Putin are going to work to undermine the West democracies. And when he was in Moscow, and he said to Putin on the way out, I researched this, I looked at the video of it. He said, the two of us are driving changes the world hasn't seen in 100 years. What he was referring to was the collapse of the Qing dynasty in China and the fall of the czars in Russia. I mean, Xi Jinping wants to bring down the Western capitalistic societies and is using technology to do just that. So I saw the pattern emerging, and I've been trying to warn my fellow Americans about this pattern for a number of years now. It's a very difficult message to hear, and so I'll elaborate on this as you wish.
Well, a lot has happened even recently, right? And especially when it comes to national security and its relation to technology,
Right.
right? So we've seen very, very recently TikTok, right, with its battle over the past how long has TikTok been out? I would say since 2019, about, if not earlier. I think earlier than that, 2018, I would say. So over the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen this battle between TikTok and the U.S. government, for example, right? And I've asked about this, and this battle of, you know, it's very obvious that they have this relationship between themselves as a business, and they're basically the data farming and harvesting of Americans and anybody that uses the app. And it's there, and it's diplomatic, or not diplomatic, it's ties to Chinese, right? And
Absolutely. It's owned by
yeah.
ByteDance, BYTE, ByteDance. And under Xi Jinping, all these private sector companies now have been forced to cooperate fully with the Communist Party. So TikTok is an arm of the Chinese Communist Party. And so what they do, let me describe, 170 million Americans now are on TikTok. So this is an application that is very sophisticated. Its recommendation engine recognizes what you're looking at, how long you look at it, and they can capture biometric data, so they can see the expression on your face. And do your eyes move rapidly? Do you engage? Are you fascinated, or are you bored? They can make judgments about what you're consuming, and then they can adjust it to give you more of what you really want. So that's called a recommendation engine. So that now many millions of Americans are also getting their news now on TikTok. So aside from the data that TikTok is able to collect on its users, all their contacts, all their applications, all their emails, everything, they're able to now start tilting the balance of news coverage that millions of younger Americans are consuming. In fact, this has been on the front page of the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal as well. Mainstream publications are saying that one reason younger folks are not happy with Joe Biden is because of the student loan issue, the high cost of housing, and the difficulty in obtaining satisfying, well-paying jobs. So those things are being magnified on TikTok. The Chinese are magnifying those things. And so that, in effect, is a form of cognitive warfare, is a form of interference in the American body politic. So it's very subtle, but it's very pernicious. It's very dangerous.
Well, you co-authored, and one of your major sources, I guess, would be head of the Pentagon's, I believe, counter surveillance department or counterintelligence.
He was in charge of counterintelligence at the
Right.
Pentagon's Cyber Command. The Cyber Command is the Pentagon's cyber arm. So he was a Navy SEAL. Then he went into the intelligence work and cyber, and was involved in helping the Cyber Command went into different countries around the world and helped them clean their systems out of Russian and Chinese, bad code. So, for example, they were instrumental in helping Ukraine clean out their computers before the Russians invaded. So, I mean, the Chinese and Russians between them have put malware and bad code in the critical infrastructure of so many countries, including our own. Again, this has been on the front page of the New York Times. I'm not making it up. They have inserted malware into America's critical infrastructure, meaning water, electricity, financial systems, food supply systems. And so, and we cannot find it all and get rid of it. So that's how sophisticated the Chinese have become. They have penetrated, they've learned how to penetrate our IT systems, which we built at a great burst of enthusiasm beginning in the 1990s, all based on the internet. We never dreamed that somebody would use these tools to penetrate into the innermost sanctums of our corporate and governmental decision making, but the Chinese and Russians have. It's not like they just attack our computers and go away. They're inside. Often they're able to take legitimate user IDs and passwords, which is called living off the land. And those kinds of people are very difficult to find. If you have thousands of users for one of these large corporate systems, how do you know who's real and who's not real if everybody has legitimate IDs?
Well, part of my question would be, when it comes to the information that you're getting, right? So when you co-authored I think his name was Michael McLaughlin,
Right,
right?
right, Mike McLaughlin, right.
Yeah, right. So Michael McLaughlin, who is the head of the Counterintelligence and Cyber Command Department of the Pentagon, right? So when he was acting, he was in that department at the time, or was this after he left the department?
He was getting a law degree and was leaving. So we were able to collaborate while he was still at the Pentagon, and that collaboration continued after he left. The Pentagon did have to review the book to make sure that we did not disclose any classified information.
So when it came to him as a source, did you have any other sources or people that you reached out to or spoke to that like 100% would know, or was it more of a following along with the topic itself?
Well, we talked to some very smart people. Talked to Chase Cunningham, Duwan Lee, Mark Montgomery, the former admiral who's now in charge, was in charge of the Solarium Commission, which was a very rigorous look at the federal government's IT systems and what should be done to protect them. So we cast our net across a pretty broad array of people and interviewed them. Emily de la Bruyere. So we interviewed Gordon Kovitz. We interviewed a lot of people. It wasn't just, this book is not based solely on his experience or my experience. It was based on solid reporting from people who really know their stuff.
Okay, so when it came to gathering this information, right, and drawing and analyzing it then, right? So when it came to putting it into a book as well, or multiple books, I guess my question would be, what's the most important thing that you could say as a solution, that you could point to as a solution for all of this?
Well, we're not organized as a government or as a society to address it. For example, the federal government. Let me take the different pieces of the puzzle. The federal government is not unified. Does not have a unified cyber division. You have within the Department of Commerce. You have the National Institute of Standards and Technology (NIST), which does very important work of tracking the vulnerabilities in our software and trying to persuade people to patch them. Then within the Department of Homeland Security, you have CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Then you have, in law enforcement, you have the FBI and the Justice Department. Then in the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, there are 17 different intelligence agencies as part of the allegedly unified intelligence arm of the government. But they don't necessarily share information with each other on a real-time basis. They're rivalries. They fight over budgets. I mean, the federal government is fundamentally a giant organism that is funded and fights for its funding and staffing, and so they try to create a cyber czar within the White House, Chris Inglis, but it did not go well because of the infighting among the different people in the federal government. So in effect, the federal government is flying blind. And then the other part of the problem is that we Americans believe that there's a sharp distinction between the public sector and the private sector, something the Chinese and Russians don't recognize at all. So, for example, our critical infrastructure is owned overwhelmingly by the private sector. So the private sector owns the dams, the power grids, owns the ATMs, owns everything that we depend on for our infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So when the government says to them, why don't you build in greater resiliency, greater resistance to cyber disruption, the private sector's response is, well, if you think we're vulnerable, isn't it your job as the government to pay for upgrading our systems? So this is where the discussion stops, because the private sector, they want to make money on a quarterly basis, of course. They see that as their mission. They do not see it as their mission to invest in a power plant just for the sake of what might go wrong. Another example of this dysfunctionality, I mean, our system is open. We're pluralistic. We believe in that. But another example of where it's gone wrong is the Pentagon has 300,000 companies in its defense industrial base. These 300,000 companies of various sizes provide the military with all the technology, all the systems that it needs, that it uses. So, but because they're private sector entities, when the Pentagon has said, we want to audit your books to make sure there are no foreign players in your systems spying on the technology that we, Pentagon, is buying, the CEOs of these companies have consistently resisted that because they don't want the government snooping around in their business. But as a result of this uh, contretemps, I think might be the right word. It's a dispute. Uh, the Chinese are in there. The Chinese have stolen massive amounts of technology from the American defense industrial base, including, get this, George, they stole the designs for aircraft carriers. Their new Fujian aircraft carrier is based on the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier that the U.S. Navy operates. So imagine the U.S. military now is looking at Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army, that's equipped and armed with stolen American technology. And they are certainly a peer or near peer competitor. And they've done it on the basis of things they've stolen, ideas and information that they've stolen from the American defense base. So here's a case where we Americans can't agree on how do we protect ourselves, but the Chinese don't have any such problems. They're able to penetrate and steal at will.
Well, one major difference, I just had his name is Frederick or Rick Hotchner, and he was, I believe the term is executive manager at the CIA, something like that, right? He was in a management and leadership position. And I asked him as to why it kind of seems like, despite the fact that, for example, TikTok is known to be a it's known to be an asset of the Chinese government, right? Or at the very least have relationships and collect data on behalf of, to some extent, the Chinese government, if not directly, just be an extension, like you're saying. And he did say that a lot of the problem does come down to conflicts of interest between the government, right? And I've had multiple people, former
Wait,
FBI agents
conflicts of interest between the U.S. government and what, or within the U.S. government?
within the U.S. government, between
Right,
the U.S. government agencies, I should have said.
right.
So, but that'd be the FBI, the CIA. They can't. But the major point that Rick got to was that China is a dictatorship, right?
Right.
Whereas, and they're a very closed off society, whereas America is a very open society. It has a lot of problems, and you know, we can that's a whole other discussion. But generally, it's a very open and democratic society, and there's a lot of things and processes. Whereas China, if Xi Jinping signs something off, or if a Chinese official signs something off, it just gets done,
Right.
right? So
Yeah, Americans can't even imagine what a dictatorship really means. He has consolidated power, and to a degree that not even Mao Zedong possessed back in the 1960s and 70s, because he's been able to use technology to create an authoritarian state where the facial recognition technology is pervasive. If they want to find you, they can find you anywhere in the country. Boom, they've got you. So if they want to monitor, well, they are monitoring your phones. Whatever you say online is being monitored. If you say something that's critical of the government, you get a knock on the door. I mean, so imagine, most Americans can't even imagine what it's like to live in such a system.
right, and I've had people that have lived in China, right? And one thing that has been said is that as long as you don't criticize the government, this is a friend of mine that used to live in China. I don't talk to him as much, but he was born and he lived in China for years, and he's like, well, as long as you don't criticize the government, it's okay. And then I thought to myself, I'm like, well, what if you do want to criticize the government,
Yeah,
right?
right,
And that is the society that they live in, and it's a very different culture, because in America we kind of pride ourselves on the fact that we have the right and the ability to criticize the government, and the right and the ability to criticize certain people in power. In China, that doesn't really seem to exist, if at all. And if you do, you're gonna immediately be known, right? And
immediately.
yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people have disappeared into the gulag. I mean, the prison camps. I mean, that's what happens. No trial or merely a perfunctory trial. You're just gone. You're just disappeared. So yeah, we can't imagine. I mean, are there some abuses in the United States? Does the FBI snoop? Yes, but they don't throw people into the gulag without any kind of trial or proceeding. They just don't have the power to do that. So, so it's a dramatically different society that Xi Jinping has created than the China that I knew when I lived there.
Well, when you lived there, what was it like then compared to what it is now? Just like on a general basis.
Well, there was a sense of hope, a sense of opening, a sense of a greater pluralism. I mean, nobody knew exactly how it would play out. It was called the peaceful evolution theory that as time went by, the Communist Party would accept a slightly reduced role in society. Dissidents could exist. Dissidents could have lawyers. Uh, Women could have rights. Minorities could have special rights as well. That there were even elections were being held at the village level. There were signs of stirrings of that from a Western point of view were very positive. That one could believe that China was evolving, not necessarily down the same path as Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, all of whom became democracies, but that the Chinese were not immune to these forces of pluralism, of diversity, of freedom. And now it's been choked off. I mean, now it's been 180 degrees. They're headed back in the direction of you must be loyal. You must be loyal to the party. You must obey the edicts from the center. And there is no opposition. There is no pluralism. It's been wiped out.
Well, one question I would also have is that we've spoken a lot about China, but you also mentioned that Russia has a very heavy hand in this to some extent.
Right.
And a lot of that seems to come down to the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that being the United States. So when it comes to, and this is something I've spoken more about recently as a question, but you get people that have sold secrets, right? And communicated secrets that are Americans, right? That have been put on trial and arrested. I think one even got convicted recently. He was a former FBI official. He got arrested and convicted on charges relating to espionage with Chinese and Russian nationals. And this has happened many times where, in some cases, I think the very people that are chosen to investigate any moles in the FBI have been the moles themselves, right? So why don't we really see the same thing happening to a Chinese national in relation to an American, right? Like, why don't we see America more publicly, at least? Why don't we see somebody getting arrested or thrown away in jail for selling secrets to America?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand your question. Why we people have been arrested in the United States, both Americans and Chinese nationals, and bad things happen to them after they've had a legal fair hearing. So, what is your point exactly? What is your question?
I'm saying, what's the difference in why? Okay, why is it that in America people are being tried for selling publicly, right? Like, why is it public thing that multiple Americans have tried selling secrets to Russia and China, but it seems like the other way around that doesn't really happen as much. The sharing of intelligence for money does not happen between a private citizen and the government of America, right? Like, why isn't there a private citizen in China that sells secrets to America, at least not publicly?
Well, there are lots of reasons for this. One is that the Chinese have absolute grip on their telecommunication system. So and they know who the American intelligence and top military people are because they've stolen their information during the Office of Personnel Management hack in the 2014-2015 timeframe. They stole the personal details of 22 million US government employees. And subsequent hacks, they've stolen more. So they know exactly who the American intelligence people are. They have their emails, they can track them. And so the telecommunication system is completely controlled. So it is very, very difficult for the Americans to recruit uh, people in China. And the goals are different. The American intelligence wants to understand, what is Xi Jinping going to do when it comes to Taiwan? What is the nature of his relations with the PLA? Strategic level kinds of things. The Americans are not really in there stealing technology on a massive basis because we developed our own technology. We don't need to be stealing it back from the Chinese. So there's just enormous differences in the profiles of what their intelligence and information gathering capabilities are versus what ours are. The CIA had a network in China that was broken up. The Ministry of State Security broke it up in the 2010-2011 timeframe. They found a former CIA guy in Hong Kong, a Hong Kong Chinese, and they bribed him. They got the names of the key CIA players, and they all disappeared. There are about 18 to 20 of them. So, and the other major force is that there are 3 or 4 million Chinese or Chinese Americans in the United States. The vast majority of them want nothing to do with the Communist Party, but some of them are either intimidated into cooperating with the party or lured in with a promise of gains for their family back in China and for themselves. So this is something that the Chinese government exploits pretty ruthlessly. If the Chinese nationals here in our schools and once they leave schools and go work for our companies are vulnerable to pressure from the Chinese government for access to technology and access into the American decision-making apparatus. So the degree of intelligence gathering and espionage that goes on is asymmetrical, in my view. That's my conclusion. I don't deny that the CIA and NSA try to penetrate the Chinese intelligence and Chinese information technology systems, but it's not symmetrical. They're not doing nearly as comprehensive and massive a job as the Chinese and Russians are doing. One of the other things we haven't talked about is social media. Both the Chinese and Russians are flooding our social media with posts, including AI generated posts. They're using artificial intelligence to generate fake news on our social media, and that our people just don't recognize as being Russian or Chinese propaganda. So there are so many different threads to this, and we are not able to do that in China at all because they control the information flow. So it's very asymmetric, the imbalance in intelligence gathering and influencing.
Well, another thing we also haven't gotten to talk about yet, which is and this is something that has come out recently. It is very important that the public understands part of it, at the very least, is private companies that are acting on behalf of state actors, right? So in recent times, the most popular public one that people have become aware of is something called Pegasus,
Right.
where it was created by
The
this
Israelis,
company. Yes,
Israelis.
Israeli, yes, it an Israeli company, an Israeli private organization that invented this thing called Pegasus. And I'm explaining this as context, which would basically be sold to the highest bidder and placed onto the phone of whoever that person wanted. So that
It can
could
be
be
placed on the phone without them having any clicking on any.
anything.
Right.
Yeah,
It's boom. It's on your phone.
right. So where would those organizations come into play for whether it be China hiring them to hack into the phone of an American, let's just say a famous journalist such as yourself, right? Let's just say China says, we don't like this guy. We're going to hire the NSO group to put Pegasus on whose phone so we can surveil his every move. How often does that happen? Has that happened to you? Has that happened to people that you've known? How does that work?
Well, I assume that my systems have been completely penetrated. I, I I have a camera on right now, but at night I put a little piece of tape over the camera. I turn my computer off, and my cell phone I turn them off. For years I put it my cell phone in the microwave oven to interfere with the ability to access it. I don't do that anymore. I think it's by this point it's pretty useless. But my life is an open book. Those of us who are involved in U.S.-China sensitive issues have to assume that there is no such thing as privacy, no such thing as complete discretion. The NSO is the name of the Israeli company that created Pegasus. They sell their services to governments, like they sold them to the Saudis that was involved in their tracking of Khashoggi, the fellow they killed in Istanbul. They sold it to different governments, the French government. They've sold it to different governments and different companies. I think we can assume safely that the Chinese have the same capability. If they reverse engineered it, they could knock it off. And bear in mind that every Apple iPhone is made in China. I mean, if you don't think the Chinese are smart enough to build in some sort of capabilities into the iPhones, you're engaged in a wishful walk in the park. I mean, it's been reported that they've tracked Uyghurs, the minority that lives in Western China, through the iPhones. But I think that they would have the capability to go after many more targets using the iPhones as the device of choice.
Have you ever had an experience where, or have you had any direct knowledge that you were being surveilled? Because I'm only asking this because you did say that you would put your phone in basically a Faraday cage of some kind, whether that be through a
Right.
microwave or I don't know, a fridge, which has the same effect. But was there anything to bring that about? Was it just an intuition thing of being
Well,
proactive?
it was studying the capabilities that the Chinese have, and also talking to other China experts who are caught in this crossfire. Uh, I've spoken to one expert in Washington D.C., and he gets followed. The Chinese are on four guys are in a car, and they want him to know that they're following him, that they're watching him. So that they are here in America watching key people, and so they have that their diplomats are doing many more things than you'd expect a diplomat to do. The CIA, are they active in our embassies abroad? Yes, they are. They're often the trade attaché or cultural attaché of some sort. So yes, we play the same game, but they're doing it in a much more massive and systematic way. But the answer to your question is I've had no personal proof point that I'm being observed, other than the fact that I've written so many books and organized so many events at the Overseas Press Club that have been critical of was happening in China. And I wouldn't go to China right now. I probably couldn't get a visa, and even if I did get a visa, I would be reluctant to go because of the possibility that I would be brought in for questioning or more.
Well, now that's interesting what you said about your friend of having four guys in a van follow him. Basically as I guess bravado, as a way of saying
A
that we
means of
can,
intimidation.
yes, a means of saying that we can find you anywhere. So why? Like what was that experience for him? Because was it like, how did he realize that that's the Chinese? Was he getting like a call in the middle of the night saying like, those four guys that followed you, we saw you looking around. Like, was it that direct, or was it just like he kept on seeing them everywhere he
Right.
went?
No call. He's at a think tank and is often quoted and has been critical of some aspects of what the Chinese are doing. So if you see four Chinese guys in a car, you see them more than once, you get the message. You don't have to have any explicit threats or any explicit conversations. You get it. You get it.
Have you met anybody that has been directly threatened by the Chinese government?
They don't work that way. I mean, direct threats. They just that is not their style. I mean, they are more subtle than like the mafia might be, or tough guys might say we're going to take out your little sister. I mean, threats like that. Chinese don't operate that way, and I don't think the Russians do either. They're There's a step more subtle than that. The knowledge of what you're doing, where you go, who you talk to, they that is what they possess, and that is a source of power.
what's the most extreme or forms like or examples of intimidation that you can think of by the Chinese government? Because if you're saying that they don't directly tell you we're going to do X, Y, and Z, it's just more the idea that they can do X, Y, and Z, right?
Right. Well, they've kidnapped Westerners, held two Canadians. The government took them into custody, and they've begun expatriating people, uh, foreign nationals as well as Chinese nationals from places like uh, Laos, Cambodia. There are certain countries where that if you go and they have a massive Chinese presence, you are subject to being um, put on a plane back to China. They've also started using Interpol's red alert system that if they want to find somebody, they've persuaded Interpol to put out a red notice, a red alert, so that they can find that person. So the Chinese believe that they have the right to engage in global surveillance on anything, on any subject that affects them. Do the Americans believe that? Yes, Americans also believe that, but the Chinese are going after it in a much more massive and persistent way than the Americans are capable of doing.
Well, then we get the NSA, right?
Right.
Which, I mean, just I think it was the other day, the House Congress, I'm just going to say Congress, right? They signed a bill basically continuing to allow the warrantless surveillance of Americans and people abroad. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because if this is happening, right, and the US has all this surveillance capabilities, and everybody talks about what a problem this is, and uh, and you can read various documents yourself and reports yourself, and it talks to the extremity of having things like having direct surveillance of internet cables and so on and so forth. My point with that is that if we have all these extreme surveillance capabilities ourselves on our own citizens, and we're doing this 24/7, hundreds of millions of phone calls every day, possibly now billions, and we're doing all this,
I would
why?
say
Yeah,
I would disagree that
yeah.
we're doing it across the board. The law that Congress has been arguing about it now is passed would continue the ability of our agencies to track what foreigners are doing, foreign threat actors, whether it be terrorists or Russian assassination teams, tracking them in Europe, tracking them in Africa. So what happens when one of those kinds of people is in touch with an American? And what happens when one of those people comes to America? Do our agencies have to then stop and turn it over to the FBI? The FBI is supposed to be in charge of domestic surveillance. NSA and CIA are supposed to be foreign only. But what happens when somebody is engaged, an American is engaged in, I won't use the word conspiracy, but a conversation with someone we know is a bad actor? Should we then allow that bad actor to come to the United States, and then the NSA has to go to a court, or the FBI has to go to a court to get a court order to then monitor what that person is doing in the United States? Uh, that's very awkward. That's very we would lose the trail of the bad actor. So it's very controversial. I understand, but my co-author and I believe that the U.S. government needs to have the capability to follow the trail of people who mean to harm us as a nation.
Well, my question in general is just that if we have the capacity, right, to do certain things, and we have these abilities, because I mean, you can ask anybody that about any expert about privacy will tell you that privacy doesn't really exist for an average person,
Right,
right?
that's true. Unfortunately, that's true, and we give up much of our privacy by leaving a trail of what we buy online, what websites we go to, uh, and so we reveal so much about ourselves online that we give freely of our privacy in exchange for neato cool things on the internet. So yes, we there has been a massive uh, invasion of our privacy, and Americans don't seem to care about that. Americans are willing to give away their information for free. So now there are companies that seek that information for commercial gain. That's what they're seeking. They're not seeking to understand your political sensitivities, or well, maybe some of the political parties are trying to get data on voters' preferences and things like that. But in general, overwhelming use of the data is for commercial reasons. They're not trying to uh, take over people's lives. So I think that there is a difference between what is happening with American data and what in the hands of American agencies and American companies versus what the Chinese and the Russians are doing about it, doing with that.
Well, how do we, or why, I should say, why is it that for Chinese, um, I'm trying to think of the term, I guess people that are working on behalf of the Chinese government to, let's just say, go into Washington and threaten the man that you're talking about without threatening him, right? By just following him home or doing these very subtle, not so subtle things to basically send out the message that we know where you are, and even in your own country, we can find you, even in Washington, D.C. What becomes problematic is that that's the area where so much government activity occurs. There's hundreds of thousands of politicians, and I'm sure you can think of any number of things that would exist in Washington, D.C. Intelligence
Yeah.
hubs.
Oh, yeah. It's very important. Very important.
So if there's four people that are working on behalf of the Chinese government that are able to do that, what does that tell you?
Well, they first of all they have a lot of people. They have 1.4 billion people. They've got a lot of bodies. That's one overwhelming disadvantage we have is that uh, Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, testified that the Chinese have an advantage in just in sheer person power when it comes to the cyber stuff. He put it at 50 to 1. The Chinese have 50 cyber experts for every one that the FBI has, for example. So the sheer scale of what they can do is something we find very, very difficult to track, to understand, because there's so many of them and they can come at you from so many different directions. So, um, does that answer your question?
Kind of. I'm just saying that it doesn't make sense how in one of the most secured or surveilled areas in the United States, Washington, D.C., where there's the president, the Secret Service, the FBI,
The
every sort of,
military,
yeah,
everything.
every single headquarters you could ever imagine. Probably a director of every agency has a spot there, an office there, whatever. Why is it that there are individuals that can just walk in and say to somebody or go up to somebody and follow somebody that works at a think tank that are working on behalf of a spy agency? That's it. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, that's the reality, my friend. So the Chinese have been getting into the State Department and Commerce Department and military communications. At this time, I believe it was last year that Blinken was going and Raimundo, the Commerce Secretary, were going to China. The Chinese were downloading massive amounts of emails from State Department and Commerce Department. Then we found out that the Volt Typhoon was a penetration of Microsoft's email system, that the Chinese were deep into the military's communication patterns centered on Guam. Guam was incredibly important because it remains incredibly important because it's the center, one of the nerve centers for American military operations in the entire Pacific. So if the Chinese are able to get into the email systems and monitor traffic, that tells you just how deep the penetration goes.
Well, what is the response back? How do and I kind of touched on this before, but how or why is it that despite the fact that we know that this is going on and we have all these abilities, right, for just even one agency, right? I always
Yeah.
use the NSA as the example, but the NSA has all these capabilities to basically hack into any phone on the planet, right? Or at least most of them, I would say.
Yeah, probably
And
anyone, probably any.
yeah, probably any of them if they had enough time, but why is it that they aren't seemingly using them for just the most direct purpose. Because if I was the president, let's just say, I would say, all right, I deal with things very directly. I would just say, okay, get this person's phone, get the intelligence from that, download a copy of it. All right, let's see what information we can find from there, and then work from there. But the idea that nobody seems to be doing that feels kind of strange. So why is that happening?
Well, okay, I'll explain it. It's because we don't trust each other. That's a simple answer. That we don't trust the NSA to operate in the United States. The FBI doesn't trust the NSA. The CIA doesn't trust the NSA. The FBI and CIA hate each other. They are bitter rivals, and so that they don't want to cooperate. They want to maintain the independence of their agencies. They don't want to share their secrets with other agencies because they fear that the other agencies will use it to in inappropriate ways, or will use it to Bigfoot them when it comes to getting funding from Congress. So our government agencies are not organized in any coherent fashion. The U.S. government, after 9/11, decided we needed to get serious about terrorism. So they created the Department of Homeland Security. Everybody said, okay, it's time to do that. Nobody really complained. Everybody cooperated. But now we're on the receiving end of something equally pernicious, more subtle, not as bloody, of course, but something equally pernicious, massive, coordinated, and we can't agree on what to do. We can't agree about it. Why can't we protect ourselves? The answer is we don't agree among our government agencies and then our technology companies. Someone like Microsoft has allowed their systems to be penetrated. We've seen it time and time again. So if I were president of the United States and I called up the head of Microsoft and said, kick the Chinese out of your systems, Microsoft would say, sorry, it's too late. The Chinese are deeply penetrated in the Windows. And so that's why the Chinese can get into all these cloud computing systems that Microsoft is talking about and touting as being most safe and most secure. The Chinese are inside our own technology companies. So it is a massive problem that would require years of concerted and cooperative effort across different government agencies and in conjunction with the private sector. It would be like the reaction to Pearl Harbor or Sputnik or 9/11. We need that kind of concerted, focused response, or this will just continue. It'll never change.
Well, when it comes to the president's responses, right, we've seen a tremendously different people and administrations over the past 16 or so years, I would say, especially in the past 8, right? So we went from, Obama, then to Trump, then to Joe Biden, right? When before that we had Bush, but we had all these drastically different people in office and all these different drastically different presidents. And you've been in this for about 40 years. So out of all the presidents that you've seen, especially within recent times, do you think that there's been anyone that has, really done a good job? Do you think any of them have damaged any U.S. response against China? Do you think there was any conflicts of interest involved with any of the presidents and China? So I guess what are your thoughts on the president between different U.S. presidents' responses to this sort of a threat?
Well, I mean, what we really need is a president who understands the internet and understands the digital era, who then says, all right, I want to organize the government in a way that there's one person in charge of defending the government's cybersecurity, and this person is in charge of the civilian sector cybersecurity. But we haven't had, Obama was the closest to it as a younger guy. He, to this day, probably understands far more about this stuff, unfortunately, than Biden does. Donald Trump really never cared about the policy issues. He was a very superficial, transaction-oriented president. So we have not had the presidential leadership on this issue that we really need. Obama, for example, sat down with Xi Jinping in the 13 or 14 time frame and said, please stop spying, please stop cyber snooping for commercial reasons. Xi Jinping said, oh, okay. And it stopped for a while, but then it kicked right back up again. So Obama was naive to trust the Chinese. And so it's been a pervasive, consistent problem. You can't blame one guy, one president for failure. It's been a failure of our system.
Do you think that the response when it comes to the people, right? Like, for example, what could I as a citizen or you as a citizen do to prevent or help the response of this threat?
Well, TikTok is number one. If I were president, I would invoke national security grounds and shut it down. Just unplug the servers, shut down the lines. Just it's gone. Let Instagram or other Telegraph or other services replace at least part of what TikTok is doing. But so that would be one place average Americans could start, is getting rid of TikTok. Do you know that the Chinese do not allow TikTok in China? They have something called Douyin, which gives users patriotic messages about educational messages, and it limits the Chinese young people to 40 minutes a day online, and they can enforce that. They have the capability to enforce that. So and our social media right now is a giant sewer, partly because Americans don't insist on getting their information from sources that are established. And I realize it sounds like an old fuddy-duddy saying, why doesn't everybody read the New York Times? But it's inherently dangerous to surf on your phone and surf the different headlines that are being influenced, if not written, in other countries. That is inherently dangerous. People could stop that. Another very important thing is the idea that a corporation can protect itself from penetration. It used to work when you had a mainframe computer and everybody went to work, logged in, did their work, and then left. But the result of the mobility of telephones and the pandemic now, people are using their personal devices to interact with their corporate networks. And that means that if your personal device has been hacked, the Chinese or Russians or whoever it is can get into your corporate network, portraying themselves as you. So we need to clean up our habits, the way we use our technology. We're quick to want to exploit the fun aspects of the technology, and there are many fun aspects of it. There are many educational benefits from being able to surf the web, and I can tell you that the internet was an incredibly valuable tool for me in writing this book. I was able to see what Chinese foreign ministry spokesmen were saying, or what they were saying in Russian television. So it's an incredibly valuable tool, but it has to be used carefully. And we're not using these devices and these systems carefully. So, and now comes AI. And now we have high school boys getting nudification technology and taking pictures, headshots of the girls in their classes, subjecting them to nudification technologies and sending these illicit images around on the internet. I mean, this AI has the risk of opening the floodgates to whole new levels of abuse, disinformation. So as a society, we have not taken all these things seriously enough to try to figure out, how do we educate ourselves about this? How do we teach our kids what's quality information versus what's not quality information? How do we teach our kids what are the right ways to use these tools? What are the wrong ways to use the tools? And what are the consequences if you send around naked pictures of girls in your class? Can you imagine? High school kids and even middle school boys are able to do this. So we've unleashed very powerful tools, and we've not allowed or are not encouraged our educational sector, our civil society sector, our political leadership to keep pace with what the technology is doing to us. We've been overwhelmed by this technology, and our adversaries have exploited it. We need millions
Right.
more. For example, we need millions more of cybersecurity professionals. We have a terrible shortage of people who are trained and educated in cybersecurity, and that's one of our major vulnerabilities.
Right. So, looking towards the future, right? And this is gonna be the last question I ask before I stop the recording. We'll talk a little bit after the show. But where do we go, right? Exactly. Like, for just where can we go as a society in the next 5 years, right? Like, what are the options? Because it seems like a very, I don't want to say insurmountable, but it feels like a very, very hard mountain to climb, right? Multiple national threats, not just China, but also Russia on the back end. So these two obscenely powerful countries against the United States. And it feels like this very, very difficult mountain to climb. So how do we overcome it? How do we in the next, like, let's just say 5 or 10 years, where do we go? How do we go around it, above it, just to overall get past it?
Well, one of the things that the American system is known for is it is diverse, it is competitive internally, but when it unifies, when it comes together, it is one of the most powerful forces in the world. For example, after FDR declared war on Japan in 1941, the next thing he did was create a defense production board that was public sector and private sector, and they created a system that 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 allowed raw materials, important metals to flow into military production. People had ration coupon books. Uh, Americans coalesced. We came together. We shared a vision of what we needed to achieve. It happened again after Sputnik because we were concerned that the Soviets, as we called them at the time, were going to dominate space. John F. Kennedy said, we got to get to the moon. So, and it happened again, as we said, after 9/11. In this case, we don't have a common grounds. We don't have a sense of urgency. Mike and I hope that our book helps create the conditions where more Americans come together and say, we have to come up with strategies, mechanisms, budgets. We cannot allow this system, this mess, I should say, to permeate and to continue to dominate our lives. That's what I hope can happen. That Americans will say, hey, maybe I should be more careful about downloading information. Maybe I should limit my kids' exposure to what's happening on social media. Maybe I should pay for more education or support more education about cybersecurity. So when Americans decide to come together, it's a very powerful force. I do not think it's too late at all for us to come together as a society, to organize ourselves, to devote the resources to doing the job. It's not too late.
All right. Well, I do appreciate you coming on, and you're welcome to come back anytime you want. Let's talk a little bit after the show. I'm going to stop recording, but do you have any final words?
No, just thank you, George, for giving me this opportunity to reach your audience. That's all I can ask for.
Absolutely. And go buy his book, Battlefield Cyber.
Right there, right there. Not too subtle, is it?
Yep. All right.